here. And then a little perspective on the applicability of the IEBC. Just in general, I know you already use part of it essentially, and you obviously already deal with existing buildings, but I want to talk about kind of how it sits in the sort of family of codes. Now it's intended to be applied, and then just dive into the structure and application of the IEBC. So for the most part, where this document, you can go back and you can see even identical wording at times, the Uniform Code for Building Conservation, which was first approved by ICBO, International Conference of Building Officials, one of the legacy organizations that was based in California, the Uniform Building Code, Uniform Fire Code, all that, dating back to 1986. I don't actually have the 86 myself. I have a draft that I think they were using in 2000 that I've looked at it occasionally. I don't know how I obtained it, but I have it for some reason. And I think it sounds like the New Jersey Rehab Code based a lot of what they did on Uniform Code for Building Conservation. They also wrapped in National Applicable Recommendation Rehab Provisions, NARP, which is, I think, the seismic stuff primarily. Actually, it may have been more than that too. And then IBC Chapter 34. I mean, that actually coexisted for a long time. And to be honest with you, it was kind of a pain keeping track of it. We had the same provisions in the IEBC that we had in 34, but it was sort of split in two, as we'll talk about the two methods. Well, of the three methods, two of them come from Chapter 34. And I've always struggled a little bit because the performance method to me is, and I know we're not really digging into that so much, but just for perspective, is kind of, it's fire, life, safety, egress. It's not structural stuff. It's not accessibility. It's none of those things. It was because of heightened area requirements that Ohio at the time could not meet because of old mill buildings and things like that, which is where they came up with that method. Anyway, and then so the first edition of the IEBC was 2003. It sort of pulled a lot of that together. The committee worked, beyond just those documents, but and pulled that together for the first edition. So I'd like to look at some of this a little bit too, sort of this regulatory spectrum. And I know, and the fire code does so many different things. It's both new construction, operational maintenance, retroactive. We have all sorts of things going on. But there's sort of the new construction end of the spectrum, where it's easy to require a lot of stuff. You're starting from scratch. It's much more cost effective. It's simpler, less political, maybe not, depending what the issue is. And then all the way to the other end, we're dealing with maintenance. Like, are the exits blocked? Are we, testing the sprinklers? Are we doing all those kinds of things? And then there's sort of the stuff in the middle. And I think the IEBC is kind of this point in time. You decide to do something, so you go use that code. The code doesn't apply unless you decide to do something. Retroactive, and it's actually, I forgot a section I wanted to put in my presentation, but I'll point it out and you might be familiar with it, is how, when we get to that, how the fire code interacts with this too. Again, not understanding everything, how it works in California, but things to keep in mind and how they relate to each other, because it gets a little strange and complex. In fact, the retroactive, in a way, well, it should be, in theory, should be a little less restrictive than, say, you're deciding to do something to your building and this is what you have to do, versus retroactive applies every single day, with some structure to, hey, you have this long to comply, and working with the jurisdiction, that kind of thing. So the scope in general of this document of the IEBC is for repair, alteration, change of occupancy, which includes occupancy classification, addition and relocation of existing buildings. I know California doesn't really use the IRC, but there's an exception that kind of helped us grapple with the fact. And there's still, if you're watching the code process, trying to figure out how the IRC deals with existing buildings. How does it do it on its own? Because it's supposed to be standalone. But this kind of says you can use the residential code if you want, but there's some exceptions you'll see, and mostly structural stuff, that refer back to you can comply with the residential if that's the code that makes sense. If you choose to use this, depends on how the states adopt it, how the local jurisdictions adopt it. But the section I wanted to put in here that I forgot to put in, which is section 101.2.1, is application of the fire code. And it says, where work regulated by this code is also regulated by the construction requirements for existing buildings in Chapter 11 of the IFC, such work shall comply with the applicable requirements of both codes. So being that, because often we get this question, and this is a prescriptive method too. I mean, it's any of the methods, is Okay, I'm doing this, I'm working at IEBC, I don't have to look at the fire code. I'm like, yeah, but that may be an entirely different jurisdiction. That doesn't mean that those provisions don't apply. Again, depending on how the regulatory system is set up and everything else, there's provisions in there that are retroactive. And, like smoke alarms and CO are in both locations, for instance, and how that all works together, and that hopefully designers maybe have that understanding from the beginning to avoid the headaches later on. Just something, I get that question a lot, and we've been grappling with it within the codes and how we scope things as to what the IEBC says to that and what the fire code says to that. The other thing is that I have to remind myself when I'm trying to figure out what the answer is. Sometimes when somebody asks me a question, with the intent of this document is to provide flexibility to permit the use of alternate approaches. So you have the three methods: prescriptive, work area, and performance method. The idea that you have three different ways you can solve the problem, but we still need to make sure that public health, safety, and welfare are addressed. I mean, we all know existing buildings are more complicated. It's harder to install systems in existing buildings. It's harder to move, dead ends around, and it's harder to deal with travel distance when it's just set up a certain way. So the IEBC is sort of supposed to be building code light in a way, but still kind of getting this minimal public health, safety, and welfare that we expect out of buildings. And again, it's for compliance for repairs, alteration, change of occupancy, addition, relocation. It doesn't apply to buildings not previously occupied unless a permit has expired, or buildings that are just continue along. It's not retroactive. Unless you do something, it's not applicable. Unless you choose to do something. Even a repair, you're fixing something, but you don't have to apply the repairs retroactively. Key definitions, of course, are addition, which is new construction, basically an extension or increase. It can be, sideways, it can be up, vertical. I was just in New York City over the weekend, and I reminded how complicated buildings can be and what the challenges they have. Lots of buildings get built on top of there. And alterations, you're choosing to, I always say, this is one of the things we'll talk about, like repair versus alteration. But for me, alterations are intentional changes you want to make to a building. You're going in, you're deciding to spend some money to make the building nicer, to change something, the layout, the use, or whatever. It's everything other than a repair or addition. And it tends to be a little bit more flexibility given to alterations than to additions. And you sort of see the ranking of some of the, like seismic, for instance. Alterations and repairs get to use the reduced seismic a lot, whereas additions, because it's new, have to use newer seismic requirements, as an example. And then repair is confusing because it says for the purpose of maintenance or to correct damage. It's really fixing something. The stair treads are worn out and you want to put new ones. It's not an alteration, it's just a repair. Or a forklift rams through a wall, you want to fix it. Again, a repair. It's not an alteration. You're just fixing something you have to fix. And this question, I'm sure you must grapple with this on occasion. Probably not for tornadoes, but for the picture at the top. When is a repair no longer a repair? This one we've grappled with in the code process. There's something going through the process right now. Still trying to grapple with this. To me, when there's nothing left, it's a new building, but not everybody sees it that way. Maybe California has a set way of dealing with it, but to me, this is sort of the black and white. Well, you have to go to the building code. There's no building there anymore. But there's a lot of gray areas in between that. When is it no longer repair and something more? The code doesn't speak to this. It doesn't send you back to the building code right now for this. It doesn't say, all right, you have so much, now you have to be an alteration. Because to me, there's this difference between having to do something and wanting to make some improvements, but then it gets a little bit weird when it gets to this point where there's no building left, or there's a certain amount of damage, like, you have a fire in the kitchen or something. When is that no longer repair? And if you want, I mean, since we have a couple hours to do this, we can, if you have any questions, you can jump in every now and again.
Hey, Beth, I have a question. This is Ali. When you have a repair, it says you can replace the item. So where is that fine line between a repair and an alteration?
You know, I'll talk later too, is the alteration
Okay.
level 1 in a lot of ways is not really that different than repairs.
Right.
And it gets confusing. I think the biggest difference between the two of them, I mean, I guess if you can call something repair and just stick to that. So it's, encourage them to fix things. You don't want to discourage somebody from doing something to make it better. But I think the big thing is alteration level 1 starts kicking in accessibility. So when you classify it as an actual alteration, that's when you have to start looking at, or spending 20% of your budget. I mean, granted, if it's a tiny alteration, 20% of small is not going to be much of anything. But I think that it starts triggering other things. So that's why it gets a little iffy. I've had questions mostly with structural stuff about, well, why shouldn't this be an alteration level 1? I'm like, well, because they're just fixing something. Yeah, but I have to take the whole roof off. Yeah, but that's still considered repair. It gets a little bit confusing, admittedly, but maybe having some sort of policies, I guess, to kind of clarify that. But repair is about fixing. There's no stepping stone in the code that says your repair is too big, you have to go somewhere else right now. So I guess setting up some criteria maybe for, what falls under a repair, what doesn't. I know New York City's grappling with some of this as well as to, what rises to the next level.
Beth, Joseph has his hand raised.
Oh, okay. Hi, Joe.
Beth, how are you?
Yeah.
Hey, I wanted to make a quick statement, really, kind of get your viewpoint on it. I get asked this a lot, particularly when it comes to life safety. And, obviously the points of contention are with an existing system that may be there that, say, is no longer functioning, or that is in disrepair, or that's potentially in disrepair. Or and you have a tenant improvement happen in the building. What sort of a process?
I'm having a tough time hearing you, Joe. It's going in and out a little bit.
Oh, hold on a second.
You still there?
Beth, could you hear me now?
That's better. Yes. Thank you.
I'll mute myself. I'll come back to this.
Okay. Change of occupancy. This particular definition, I'm not going to lie, has been giving me some more headaches lately. But when you really read it carefully, and I think I've read it so many times now, I think I know what it's trying to say. It was changed for 2021. Basically, it says, any of the following shall be considered as a change of occupancy where the current IBC requires a greater degree of safety, accessibility, structural strength, fire protection, means of egress, ventilation, or sanitation than is existing in the current building or structure. And then it talks about, okay, change of occupancy classification, change in the purpose, or change in the level of activity within a building, or a change of use. And there's a definition of change of use that honestly, to me, sounds just like item 2, but the intent is there. But the idea is that I think very specifically, they're comparing to the current IBC versus the building code it was, say, built under. We've had some arguments about that, like, well, yeah, but that building didn't have sprinklers. It's the same kind of occupancy and it doesn't need sprinklers now. Again, California may have a whole different way of dealing with sprinklers. And I'm like, yeah, but the current building code requires sprinklers. This one doesn't have it. I think that's what they're trying to get at, that, and it gives you some flexibility, because if you have a building where you're changing occupancy or use and there's nothing in the building code that really would be much different. Again, this requires like a whole review of the code. But it gives a little safety valve to deal with those really minor things, or even an occupancy, for fire protection stuff. We don't have risk levels, for instance, in the work area, that you say you went from a M to a B and nothing really has changed, then maybe you don't have to go do something that the code would now require. I don't know if it would, maybe the other way around would be more logical, but kind of giving you a little bit of room to look at the risk changes of what the code is now requiring versus what that building actually has. And then we've argued a lot about our occupancy classification, you know, an A1 to an A2 versus an A to an M or something. A to an M clearly is a change of occupancy classification. I look at an A1 to an A2 as a change of occupancy classification. Others do not because they're in the same group. So depending on how that's interpreted could affect some decisions later on. But I've always looked at it, you know, especially like if you're going from an H2 to an H1, I mean, that would be a jump in risk levels. And so this kind of gets at that too, I guess. But nonetheless, that's something to consider. It's a little confusing, but I think it gives a little bit of flexibility too. So this is my my figure that I came up with to try to look at the overall structure of the document. Chapter 3 is sort of the hub of the whole thing. I mean, we have chapter 1, admin, chapter 2 is definitions. Chapter 3 is sort of how do you use this book and what applies generally. What it first does is it pulls repairs and relocated buildings outside of any of these 3 methods. So no matter if you're using work area, performance, whatever, it doesn't matter. All repairs are chapter 4 and all relocated buildings are chapter 14. So those are separate, which is why it gets a little confusing sometimes, making sure you know the difference between the repair and alteration in every situation. But there's 3 key methods, as you know: prescriptive method, which we'll talk about, comes from 34, work area method, which you're kind of really looking at, and then performance method in chapter 13, also coming from 34. But there's really 2 other methods that exist, in my opinion. Whether they get used often, that may be a different story, but I think it's worthy of acknowledging the fact. I would suspect if anybody said, hey, I want to comply with the IBC just like a new building, I don't think anybody would refuse that. It's way more restrictive generally. So, but it's an option. It's always there. And then exception to section 301.3, we'll talk about, basically says if you comply with the building that is constructed and the building official, well, code official authorizes this, allows it, then you can work based on that document versus on any of these. I suspect that would have to maybe be, many jurisdictions say, all right, if the code is no more than, I don't know, 5 editions old or something. I don't know. I mean, you kind of have to set what that would be maybe at a state level, if it's a really state set thing, or maybe, I don't know what level of flexibility you would give more locally. But I wanted to look at that section for 2 reasons, actually. The first reason I thought of before was actually what's highlighted in yellow, but it says the alteration, addition, or change of occupancy, so no repairs are in there, or relocated buildings, of all existing buildings shall comply with one of the methods listed in 301.31, 32, or 33, basically the 3 kind of core methods that we know, as selected by the applicant. So some folks have asked me about that. I'm like, it specifically allows the designer to choose what works best for them. I think when you're dealing with existing buildings, that flexibility is very helpful for them to take a look and see what works best. If they have a really minor thing, it might really make sense just to use the prescriptive method. Something more substantial, they want a little bit more guidance as to what exactly that would mean to them. And then performance method for maybe those really old buildings, if you were looking at that just height and area wise, they're not going to make it. Maybe, you know, some other options are there. But the exception says, subject to the approval of the code official, alterations complying with the laws in existence at the time the building or the affected portion of the building was built shall be considered in compliance with provisions of this code. New structural members, there's certain things, actually, I don't know if I got that. I get it. So we had new exceptions added because we had a lot of questions about, okay, you could just comply with the building that it was constructed under, code it was constructed under, but what about accessibility? I mean, Kim Parlberg and I struggle with that because we're trying to make sure you're not out of compliance with ADA. So it doesn't care, ADA doesn't care that you used your old building code if you don't address accessibility. So that was added. And then there's certain requirements, again, for federal stuff, the flood hazard stuff that you still have to do, and structural provisions that you still have to meet. That looks like the number got chopped up. I think it's 906, should be at the end there, not 90. So yeah, to me, there's sort of 5 methods. Obviously, primarily you're using the 3 methods that are there. But now looking at having more than one method, you might take a look at how that would apply. Maybe California has removed that. I don't know, even in how it's being addressed right now. There's been a lot, I don't know if everybody but follows the code process for IEBC. We've moved a lot of stuff into Chapter 3 because, for the reason I was talking about with accessibility, certain things have to be applied the same. Why wouldn't you apply them the same? And in addition, staff secretariat to this, writing the same thing over and over and over again seems a little silly if you're trying to make them all the same. Just from a perspective, so we grapple with, the uniqueness of each method versus really what should be applied the same. So some of the things that we have the general provisions, storm shelters, structural design loads, that's been in Chapter 3 for a while. In situ loads is a newer one. It's just consistency on that. Accessibility, smoke alarms, CO detection, and we've moved to the Chapter 3 in 2021. And there's a brand new provision that was not addressed before, Section 309 on exterior wall coverings and envelopes. So 302 is sort of the basic provisions that we've pulled out, I think, of the prescriptive method at some point in time and made them all the same. How we deal with dangerous conditions, deal with additional codes, what other codes are referenced in that jurisdiction, kind of the scoping of things, existing materials, what's okay, what's not, asbestos and hazardous materials, things like that you shouldn't, but hazardous building materials, I should say in general, and new and replacement materials, what's allowed, what's not. Because you're allowed to use sort of some in-kind materials as long as they don't fall into a hazardous category. Storm shelters, I mean, the biggest thing is if somebody builds one, they want it to comply with ICC 500, but it's triggered mostly just for Group E, and I suspect this is really not applicable to California. You're dealing with other kinds of hazards, wildfire and seismic, not tornadoes. And it's been kind of getting clarified, a little bit more applicability. I mean, this is a little bit more on the structural side of things, but it's consistent with the building code. Because again, and it's only additions because we're talking about new structures, but triggering some more construction of these. The structural design loads used to just be the seismic, but they've added some things for live loads for consistency, snow loads on adjacent buildings for consistency. This is an issue. Well, depending where you are in California, this could be an issue. And then seismic, that's all those seismic loads have been there and referencing a lot of the standards and also even the appendix chapters that were developed to deal with a lot of the seismic retrofit stuff. This is a very short section that just basically says anytime you do in situ testing, it needs to comply with IBC 1708. They felt was important enough that they did not want it to occur incorrectly, so it's consistent for all methods. Accessibility, again, I mean, this one, I think we spent so much time making sure everything was the same between methods and we missed stuff. And they really, from ADA and the Fair Harbor and trying to keep us sort of giving as much, structure to it for existing buildings to be able to comply correctly. I mean, that's what we do with accessibility. We're just trying to be consistent with the federal law so that it's just part of the construction process and avoids a lot of lawsuits, I think, for a lot of designers, honestly, by complying. But basically, 306, in a sense, is really an exception. It kicks in, it gives the trigger for when accessibility applies. Any additions have to comply as new, as the new construction. Gets a little confusing with existing buildings, but we try to patch those two pieces together. And then alterations, it's only when there's actually alterations. A change of occupancy without alterations, which I suspect is somewhat rare or doesn't happen all the time, usually has some alterations, but you actually have to have alterations before ADA really applies. We tried to clean that up in the last couple of years because it's been a little bit unclear. But basically, you comply with Chapter 11 unless technically infeasible, and there's a number of kind of exceptions or allowances within 306. And anytime you're affecting an area containing primary function, you have to make some upgrades, but it's limited to 20% of the cost. Smoke alarms used to be throughout all the methods. Actually, it wasn't in the performance method at all. That's now in 307, so it applies consistently. One thing I've grappled with, especially since I'm talking to folks that deal with fire codes and stuff too, is that I suspect pretty much most states or anywhere in the US would retroactively require smoke alarms in some form in existing buildings. There is an exception that you only have to do it for alteration level 2 or 3, but I suspect that the fire code would scope to have some of that stuff anyway, but something just to think about so it's clear there's no miscommunication on that. And for existing buildings with additions or alterations, again, repairs are not dealt with here. Same thing with CO. I know there's some big changes coming for CO, but this is 2021. 2024 will have a much more sweeping kind of reference to when you need them, but it's the same idea as the smoke alarms, making sure that they're consistently put in all buildings, whether or not you use the work area method, performance method, or prescriptive method. And there's some exceptions if you're doing only exterior work and things like that. This next one was put in, it's applicable to anything. You have to take a look at the language because anytime you repair, alter, add, there's a change of occupancy, relocation, any of those kind of situations. But anytime you're putting exterior cladding on, we wanted to make sure that it was very clear that chapter 14 and 26 apply for those materials. There is some criteria put to it, so it's not like anytime you touch anything on the outside of it, but if it's over 2 or more consecutive floors and greater than 15% of the total wall area on any side of a building. I mean, the issue is important enough that it needed to make sure that we comply with the building code for that. I mean, I guess in theory, you probably get that, but it was just raised to a high enough level that to make sure that everything is in compliance, because I mean, existing buildings have some things that aren't quite as new, the same as new. So it's just a good practice to make sure we get that. The other thing, after looking at this code a lot and looking at each section having the same kind of provisions, you'll see in each of the methods, they all have flood hazard requirements consistent with federal requirements. The federal folks, Rebecca Quinn, always make sure we stay consistent with the federal requirements for floods. The structural community has worked really hard, at least for the work area method and prescriptive, to be consistent. There's some debate on how structural gets dealt with when you're in the performance method, but it's been consistent in method to method. Even if they deal with it differently, the provisions are basically the same now. Emergency escape and rescue openings, we've tried to be consistent as possible between at least work area and prescriptive method on these. The classroom acoustics in Group E, that's a newer provision that came in that's consistent between each of the methods. And we staff like Kim and I have been trying to really make sure we're capturing each of those methods. If somebody submits something, for instance, to me that's only on prescriptive, that we know that there's the same provision in another area, we want to make sure that they're going to stay consistent. Sometimes we miss them, no doubt, it happens, but we're trying to get more and more consistent with some of these things. So again, you probably already used the repair section, but I mean, it's pretty basic. It provides specific provisions on how to structural repairs that can be made. Historic repairs, they actually deal with in chapter 12. But the idea being that work shall not make the building less complying than it was before the repair was undertaken. I mean, sort of a lot of that language with alterations and additions, certain minimums when repairs are undertaken. And in kind of the main sections, just to get a sense of what's in there, we have building elements, materials. That's kind of, you know, overall construction. That's where you find fire resistance in general, things like that. But there is a requirement to trigger replacement of glazing with the IEBC or IRC, but everything else is, as long as you don't mess with it and you keep it the same, you're fine. Same thing with fire protection. Keep the level of fire protection you have, maintain your level of egress. Electrical, we just went through some changes, actually working on those now. What considers repair, what you need to do, what needs to comply with the electric code, that kind of thing. Mechanical draft systems, I think there's some allowances there, and low flow toilets are required when you're repairing them, or I guess replacing them, I'm assuming. So diving in the prescriptive method I know the California uses and is most familiar with. As a reminder, it comes from chapter 34, and it was kept track in both documents for a while, and then in 2015, I think, I'm forgetting which edition, I think 2012 was the last time it was in the IBC, was basically only in the existing building code. But the prescriptive method was everything but sort of the scoring method that was the end of chapter 34. And it contains the provisions for alterations, addition, change of occupancy, and historic buildings. I like to look at this method as, I forget how generally speaking, if you take all the structural stuff out of there, everything that's consistent between methods, it's mostly the structural, there's a whole load of things in there. It starts looking just like some really simple administrative sections is really what it comes down to, which are very good for some projects. Maybe other projects it's more difficult, and we'll talk about as we go through additions, alterations, change of occupancy, and that kind of thing. But it's really a much more administrative language at the core of it as to what to do when you have these things. Whereas work areas, we'll look at it, it sort of dives deeper. It's a bit more prescriptive, ironically, I guess. Additions comply with IBC for new construction, cannot make the existing an addition less compliance, and height and area must comply with IBC. That's a little bit more, specific, telling you, or you at least got to keep track of that very specifically. And I mean, going back to the IBC for new was pretty straightforward too. Alterations, pretty basic. Alterations need to comply with IBC. Depending on how extensive they are, that could get a little confusing, I suppose. A minor change, no big deal. Something more extensive, it's that question of how much do you go back to the building code, how extensive, how much does that go? And then the building has to be no less complying than it was before. Change of occupancy, comply with the IBC. This one I sometimes wonder, I'm like, depending on how you interpret that, and the existing building is no less compliant, risk level does not increase, but there's nothing about what the risk level was. I mean, in the work area, you have a little bit of that. It's not perfect, but there is some risk levels to say, okay, this one did seem to shift. I mean, you can make some decisions on that, but it's a little bit more open, but at the same time, that could also provide flexibility too, that, we're not stuck to these particular rigid risk levels. You can take a specific situation into consideration. And then a real obvious one, I think something they've been trying to fix in the last cycle or so, that, because I don't think it mentions it elsewhere, the stairways don't need to comply for slope and pitch if they can't be changed. That's can be a difficult one to deal with if you're changing occupancy. Historic buildings, again, kind of open, it's more relaxed, basically, unless there's a distinct, especially in the fire life safety world, distinct life safety hazards can be addressed. But that one, I suspect, is also hard to justify in many cases, unless it's blatant. But it does say, you can enforce basically the IBC or codes if you have this code, if you have any of those distinct life safety hazards. Flood hazard really isn't applicable to historic, and that's consistent, and the provisions allow that. And structural gives a little bit of wiggle room for operational controls, like you have, you're literally seeing what's going to be in that building, and you can deal with it that way, even though the loading would be different if built new. So again, I'm sure you were familiar with that more, and kind of looking at the work area method, which spans, it's a little confusing because you have, chapter 5 is prescriptive, and then the span of chapters is work area method, and then you have performance, but 6 through 12 kind of governs the work area method. The scope is the same as prescriptive, but basically, I mean, it's the same idea as prescriptive, but with more detail in a sense. It sets out the scope of what is considered what in chapter 6 in the classification of work. There's 3 levels of alteration, level 1, 2, and 3. And as you go up levels, the more restrictive it becomes. Change of occupancy is dealt with 10 in chapter 10. Is kind of a, change of occupancy is often like go back to the building code sort of thing, but gives some reasonableness to some of it, depending who's looking at it, if they may or may not think it's reasonable. Additions, chapter 11, mostly goes back to the building code, and historic buildings, chapter 12. So looking first at chapter 7, it is, we had chatted a little bit just before this call, and now is, and during the beginning of the call, level 1 alterations, basically what it says, it includes removal and replacement of the covering of existing materials, elements, equipment, or fixtures using new materials, elements, equipment, or fixtures that serve the same purpose. It almost sounds like a repair a little bit, but I mean, you could almost take the drywall down and put new drywall up or something, and you haven't moved anything around. You're not reconfiguring anything. You're not adding a new system. You're just replacing a system potentially, or upgrading the same system. That's level 1. There is no work area. Nothing in the provisions are based on work area in level 1 alterations. It's meant to say, all right, you can make improvements, and we're not going to make you do too much more, but it does trigger a look at accessibility. I mean, that's probably the biggest thing that it ends up doing. But for the most part, if you keep your building at the safety level that it was before with fire protection, egress, things like that, you don't have to do much. There is some of the provisions for the window opening, safety devices, things like that are in there that apply at a level 1 alteration. It's a matter of when do you trigger something? And I think there's a lot of discussions as to when is it appropriate to start triggering more requirements in existing buildings. Like, all right, you've spent some money, you're going to do something. What can you give us to just improve this building a bit? So you have to, I think there's a lot of weighing of when is it appropriate, or when is it overly restricted, and when do we start discouraging people from fixing things or upgrading things to be better than they were before. And the level 1 is basically, has provisions to make sure your interior finishes are applicable and requirements are applicable. Like I said, window opening control devices. This is when some of that stuff does kick in, but for the most part, you're just maintaining your fire protection and maintaining your means of egress. You're not moving anything around. You still have the exits you had before. You still have all the paths that you had before. Nothing kicks in about dead end corridors or any of those things for level 1. It's just fixing what you have. Well, fixing, that's a repair, but making some upgrades, and you're not really moving things around, doing too much. And it does deal with re-roofing, and there's some triggers in there. Again, it's sort of outside probably your main interest, I guess, but it does trigger re-roofing. Although I guess that could be of distinct interest in California, I suppose, and how that happens, and making sure that it fits within the area that it's in. And energy conservation, which mostly I still need to go dive in and understand all the provisions in the energy code that deal with how you deal with alterations, repairs, additions, things like that. Again, similar to repairs, the difference is that in my mind, the best way I can differentiate this is you are making a choice to make improvements to the building versus simply fixing things or simply maintaining the treads on a stair or fixing a ripped, I don't know. I think of different examples. They're just doing little things here and there. Otherwise, it's really, you're making a choice, and it's not real clear, like I said, with the repairs versus an alteration versus new building. There's no code path that says your repair is too big now. Go to chapter 7 for alteration level 1 or chapter 2 for alteration level 2. It doesn't go there. I know there's different interpretations of that. For instance, if there's a fire and they're sort of gutting the insides of the building a bit and they're putting that stuff back, there's some folks that interpret that, well, all right, that's a level 2 alteration now. But the code doesn't really have a specific path that addresses that. And again, it triggers accessibility. I think that's the difference between, in some ways, it feels like the difference between repairs and alterations is that it starts triggering you to comply with something because you're making a choice to make changes to the building versus simply fixing it or maintaining it. Then chapter 8 is sort of the next level up. They include reconfiguration of space, the addition or elimination of any door or window, the reconfiguration or extension of any system, or the installation of any additional equipment, which includes a lot of different things. But often this is when you're going to start seeing like a floor get gutted or a tenant space getting gutted, and things are moving around. I think that's the biggest distinction. It also is a new system, which we'll talk about. There isn't always work areas in level 2, something I've grappled with, because you look at the provisions for something and says, well, within the work area, I'm like, but I don't really have a work area because there's no reconfigured space. When you look at the definition of work area, it says that portion or portions of building consisting of all reconfigured spaces as indicated on the construction documents. This is a tricky one, and I know I tried to provide some example when I looked at it and was questioning it myself, to be honest with you, but this is the difference. In level 2, you're starting to talk about work areas. You're moving things around, but level 2s also have installation of new systems you didn't have before that may not reconfigure a space. And so you have to comply with everything in chapter 7 for level 1, and then you additionally have to comply with chapter 8. And if you look at the provisions, some provisions apply to work areas, some don't, mostly like egress or things like that, or like the enclosure of stairways and stuff like that. Depends on where it falls, whether or not you have to enclose an exit stairway. I mean, if you gutted the whole inside of a building and you actually put new stairs in, you actually comply completely with the building code, which is what this third bullet item is saying. You go back to the building code anytime you put something new in. So if you gut a system, anything in that space has to comply with the IBC. But if you have like a stairway and you weren't doing anything to it, but it falls within the work area, you may have to upgrade the enclosure, for instance. And there's certain allowances, like you don't have to comply with IBC for light and ventilation. Some of that stuff just hard to do in existing. Electrical complies with chapter 8. There's some provisions in here a little bit sort of electrical light, I guess. Dead ends, chapter 8. There's some allowances because dead ends are obviously a tricky one in a building that has a certain floor plate and footprint and layout. Ceiling height in new spaces can be 7 feet. Escalators and below grade transportation can be less than 32 inches. And new structural members, although new structural members and connections have to comply with 302, which means you have to make sure that you use new stuff, new connections. Something I want to point out, something we've talked a lot about, I've talked a lot to people and saying there's no work areas in level 2 alteration. There's cases where there's not a work area in a level 2 alteration. For instance, you put a new HVAC system, like you didn't have air conditioning before, and you put it in. Technically, that's a level 2 alteration. But unless the HVAC equipment is taking up all sorts of floor space and everything else, it's really not reconfiguring the space. You're just adding a system. But it wants you to add it as brand new and meet all the requirements of new for that system. But so there's a couple of exceptions that were added, like mechanical systems, electrical system, fire protection system, abatement of hazardous materials. Anything you do, like you don't want to ding somebody or punish them, if you will, for deciding, I think I'm going to put a fire alarm system in and we didn't have one before. You would say, all right, your whole building's a work area, where are my sprinklers? I think that was kind of like, stuff like that has happened. And then the other two, the window, hardware, operating controls, electrical outlets, things like that. That doesn't trigger you looking at a work area. And then alterations undertaken for, if you're, the only reason you're doing upgrades is because you decided to spend some money on accessibility. You shouldn't be, again, raised to another level of alteration. And I've said this example before, and if you've heard my story of this, I don't want to bore you, but I had this code official one time, or I don't know if it was a code official, I'm trying to remember, that they had this, it was a school system, and they had a budget to upgrade the bracing, seismic bracing for the school. And they weren't moving anything around. They were just upgrading the bracing. And it was interpreted that, well, the entire building is a work area. Now we want sprinklers. And I love sprinklers, don't get me wrong. You all know that, but there was no work area. And instead I don't think they ended up doing anything because they couldn't afford to go to the next level. They could have improved something, but because the whole building was deemed a work area, they were level 3, which is talked about, kicks a lot more in, and you would have required sprinklers. So, there's looking at, all right, that balance between encouraging the reuse of buildings and making improvements as we go to, I'm a fire protection engineer. I love sprinklers. I would like them a lot of places, but this is where I think just trying to grapple with that and provide some structure to it so it's consistent and that kind of thing. And these exceptions, I think, help a little bit to that. Oh, the other thing I want to point out too, I meant in 603.1, Some questions that have come up over the years is when you have like cubicles and bookshelves or whatever that are, the building code has this exception already that you don't have to get a permit. So this idea was that it's not a level 2 because you move furniture around, and gives some structure to it. So it's consistent with the building code to kind of answer that question. It doesn't mean you're not still regulating things. It's just that it's not moving up to a level 3 potential alteration, because you still have to look, is there egress paths, especially it's, you know, with cubicles, there's all that stuff laid out correctly. Does it meet chapter 10 and things like that of the building code? But it doesn't warrant it being called a work area per se. So it's a distinction. It's not that the code doesn't apply, it's just not increasing it to another level of work that would end up with a lot of requirements. This I just grabbed from the commentary, honestly, but I have to say I was questioning it. Like, what is the work area? How do you define it? I was just talking also to Mike Giachetti the other day as we were discussing why, you know, why the code doesn't address like multiple projects in 1 year, and how do you add it up, and when do you, what criteria do you have? Because it's hard to judge project by project in a code and put this blanket statement for some of this stuff. But you know, work area again is supposed to be reconfigured space. This is circle, but if these aren't configured from something else, I don't know what's changing in those spaces. Maybe within the group M, there's a lot of movement around of corridors or something like that. But it really, in theory, has to be around things happening in there and things being deconstructed and laid out differently from a walls and egress paths, stuff like that. And of course, change of occupancy kicks in a lot of stuff anyway. So like, if the A2 was previously group B, then you're probably going to end up going back to the building code for things like sprinkler, fire alarm anyway. But yeah, I mean, the idea is to try to circle some level of what part of the building are you working on. Maybe it's just that one tenant space that's doing rehab, and that's the space that you count. I mean, there's arguments of like, all right, so you have this building and somebody puts a wall down the middle of it. Do you count the whole thing? Maybe there's some question of, you know, if it doesn't, you know, you have plenty of exits now, maybe you added some exits or something. I don't know if you have to include all that, or if you move a wall over a foot, what do you circle for that work area? But the idea is that, I mean, an office building that guts a floor, that's an easy one. You just call that floor the work area, I suppose. But it's unfortunately not as cut and dry, I suppose. But the idea is, are things moving around? Are we affecting the exits? And I think that's really what it comes down to. The bulk of the provisions for the work area method are in Chapter 8 and Level 2. They will all be applicable for Chapter 9 for Level 3. It was sort of a, you know, a cumulative kind of requirement situation. This again is where work areas become applicable, and not all Level 2 alterations have work areas. Especially, you know, from a standpoint of anybody wants to add safety systems or systems that are going to be more reliable, you wouldn't want to punish them for that. I think if truly in the end, if people are, I mean, I feel like the biggest trigger, the biggest issue we end up discussing is whether we need sprinklers or not, and just kind of focusing in on how that would be addressed and when that is more reasonable to happen. And it's, you know, I've been looking at some of this. I just did a presentation recently for historic building folks, and got me looking at where triggers are for historic buildings for, you know, passive stuff. And the passive stuff tends to be in the vertical elements and then change of occupancy, but stairways, guards, all these things. There is an exception for fire resistant rating in both the work area and prescriptive method. So you would have that already, that if for some reason you built a building overkill, you know, a long time ago for certain things, that you could actually, as long as you met all the building code requirements now, you could, in theory, not require certain things to remain rated. It's a confusing section in a sense, but it does give some flexibility for those situations. And it really came out of the sort of work of the healthcare folks trying to acknowledge sometimes that the requirements have changed and they're actually less restrictive. So You don't necessarily have to continue them, but you have to make sure it's well documented. Level 2, this is when the sprinkler stuff starts triggering. And level 1, it was just about keeping things as they were. But the sprinkler system triggers, I have to admit, I didn't dive into each one of them, but often they're focused in on number of occupants and shared tenants, and the availability of water. I think level 2 kind of is focused on, is there available water to the floor, versus when we get to level 3, it's available water to the site. They're expecting if you're at that level, you should be doing more, even if it's only at the site. But here it's more about, and this is one that we've grappled with. There are some alternatives. You have to have a fire alarm system, things like that, if you do that. But a lot of it, these triggers have to do with how many occupants, tenant spaces, how you have more than one tenant, which it seems strange because you even look with the egress when we get to there. Here, exit shared by more than one tenant. So level 2 doesn't do anything if it's all one tenant. Oops, a lot of that goes away with level 3. But deals with structural, electrical, mechanical, plumbing, and energy conservation. Energy pretty much just sends you back to the energy code. And then chapter 9, this is where your work area exceeds 50% of the aggregate area of the building. So we're talking about a more substantial situation. And when you get to level 9, so it's everything in chapter 7 and 8 you still have to comply with, and then chapter 9. But chapter 9, you also, those restrictions of more than one tenant or occupant load all go away. Once you hit that, you have to start applying those in the work area for the most part, unless it tells you that sometimes it will say, in addition to doing this in the work area, you must also do this throughout the floor, or it's mostly throughout the floor, or any stairs on the floor, things like that. But a lot of that restriction of, oh, well, you at least have to have 2 tenants, or at least have to have this many occupants, that goes away. It's just applicable when you get to level 3, which is why you can imagine there's a lot of debate over what is the work area, how big is it, and when does it send me to the next level. So with anything, any criteria like that, I suspect that's where folks are looking at how to manage that and how to design without having to kick into the next level. Changes of occupancy, that addresses both change of occupancy, like use, level of activity, and change of occupancy classification. It does have special uses in there as well. We've made some changes to that more recently, which is a little bit more applicable. My biggest fear, and I think what we're debating right now, and I'm not going to get into code change proposals, is, you know, do you start adding occupied roofs to that? We haven't gone there because I was thought like, oh, can you really have, say you have to comply with, for instance, high-rise buildings requirements 403 of the IBC for special uses. And when you read it, though, it says if your building has changed uses, if it's already a high-rise, it's already a high-rise. But that's where the issue comes with, say, an occupiable roof, for instance. But a high-rise is already a high-rise. You're not going back to 403. We're not going to make you put in fire service access elevators and any of those things on, since you're already high-rise. But if you're changing, you know, a group B to ambulatory care, then you're going to have to do something. So it's really a matter of whether what you're doing changes to a special use, not that you have a special use in chapter 4. Change of occupancy classification. This is where, and I've alluded to it before, like what's the change of occupancy classification? It basically says sprinklers in accordance with the IBC. With a change of occupancy, an area is not separated. So one of the things we've debated over the years was the intent of that, whether it meant to sprinkler the whole building, like the IBC says, or just the space. And then if it is just the space, when do you stop? Because you can't, doesn't make sense to just stop when there's no physical separation between spaces. So the latest edition clarifies both it's only in that space, but it has to be to some physical construction. It's not meant to be a fire barrier or anything like that necessarily, but physical construction, so at least the sprinkler system is going to operate. So if you change, for instance, you have a group B building has several stories. We're talking like Main Street building or something, and they changed the second and third floor to residential. Residential, of course, needs sprinklers, and that was the one that always tripped us up because there is no fire area with residential. You have to sprinkle the whole building in a new construction. What we're saying is you only have to sprinkle the second and third story. In that case, it's easy because you have a floor separating it. But if it was something that kind of, is horizontally next to a space that now you need some kind of physical separation, or you need to sprinkle the whole space that's continuous. That was the intent of that, to get sprinklers reasonable, but to make sure that they're going to operate at least in that space appropriately. And fire alarms in accordance with the IBC. So it's kind of like a little bit more requirement just because of the classification change than even if you were doing an alteration. Because alteration allows you to do a fire alarm, for instance, as you would for an existing building, like in Chapter 11 of the Fire Code. But here it's sending you back to the IBC for a new construction fire alarm system. And then other aspects are based on the change in risk level, primarily the heightened area, like sort of the fire resistance or passive requirements. It makes it, and it's kind of handy actually. And means of egress also uses that to risk level changes. That if your occupancy doesn't change risk, you don't have to do anything. But if it does change, that's when it triggers it. And heightened area can be probably one of the trickier ones as to how to deal with that at that point. Chapter 11 simply is compliance with the IBC, existing no less compliant due to the addition. And it does make you comply with, well, the heightened area. It's the same requirements in the prescriptive that you still need to meet that for the total new building. But again, it's new construction. And I stuck my favorite lighthouse in here in Michigan. Wanting to talk about historic buildings, kind of jumping back to Chapter 6, something I've been working with some of the historic building folks a little bit, trying to better understand how these provisions were intended to be used. And they definitely need some updating. It's going to take some time, but really looking at this. 6072, which is like sort of the scoping of the whole work area method, except as specifically provided in Chapter 12, historic buildings shall comply with the applicable provisions of this code for the type of work being performed, which means that unless there's something that says in 12 that you don't have to do it, you have to do it. So I think a lot of folks go to Chapter 12, they don't look at the whole, the scoping in Chapter 6 and all the other levels and the change of occupancy and all those things, and think all they have to do is what this says here in Chapter 12. And really, 12 is kind of like the accessibility. It's like, that's a sort of exceptions to Chapter 11 of the building code. This is sort of exceptions to what you normally would have to do for other buildings. So I think it's important to point that out. We've been trying to grapple with that a little bit and see how that all works together. But so when you get to 12, it is a little confusing. I mean, there's the second bullet really deals with unsafe and dangerous conditions need to be addressed. Now, the term dangerous is it's a defined term and it has to do with structural. Unsafe kind of applies to sort of everything else. So you have to address that. Again, some of that could be judgment, some of it's fairly straightforward. But there is a report required in Chapter 12 that if you can't meet the code, essentially, I think that's what it's trying to do. If you can't meet the code, document why, see, how are you addressing each of these? And it's a matter of, it's actually code official, I guess, in this document versus building official, how you're addressing it. I think more work could be used to clarify that, but that's the idea, is that we know that it's not really realistic for historic buildings to be able to comply with a lot of these provisions. And even the Fire Code Chapter 11 references NFPA document, is it 912? I forget which one it is. It doesn't get referenced in IEBC, but that could be an option of something to work with as an alternative for some of these. But it provides very big allowances. I mean, basically, if you see, there's a couple allowances for sprinklers that substitute, basically, if you cannot meet the requirements as 6072 says you have to, then if you put sprinklers in, a lot of your problems go away for these distinct hazards, which we've been arguing what exactly is that, but nonetheless, sprinklers are a big way to kind of address a lot of problems. If you look, it's very sweeping language. Like if you can't comply, put sprinklers in. That's not always practical, and I think that's something that I'm learning from some of the historic building folks, is that some of these little downtown areas and stuff just don't have access to those types of things. It's very difficult. You know, I don't claim to understand all of the issues, but I can sometimes see that like it makes a lot of things go away and you have to do them. But if you don't have the water supply, I could see it being an issue. But it does have like allowances for transoms and how you protect them. They give you some allowances for fire resistance for lath and plaster. You get an hour for that without having to test anything or show an assembly. And there's also, of course, the resource A that has all the different, I mean, that's right out of HUD. It's the same document for how to address some of these kind of archaic materials. Because I take issue with the archaic title at times. I'm like, oh, great. How old are these materials? But how to deal with that, you know, that they're already kind of approved and you can look up tables and work with that. I mean, it's something to work with, but sometimes they're often struggling. Like I need 2 hour separation now, and I can only get like an hour and a half. So some of those issues come up and with that. And then again, I mentioned before, there's some operational controls limiting live load. That's more about structural, but it's practical of what you can really do for historic buildings, but keep it safe enough to be able to continue on. Performance method, I know we're not talking about this much, but I wanted to touch upon it just to see how it all kind of comes together. Again, it comes from the 2012 IBC. I mean, it's consistent with that from section 3412. And it's a scoring method on non-structural issues. It's not accessibility, it's not structural, it's not plumbing, it's not mechanical. I mean, there's some mechanical pieces to it, I guess, plumbing, sprinklers, but it's not those issues. It's really fire, life, safety, egress. If you meet the minimum score, you can demonstrate compliance, and really you can break down the characteristics as passive, active, means of egress / rescue, and then occupancy-based risk. Those, to me, encapsulate what all those different evaluations are trying to get to. Again, it's non-structural, and you know, people ask, is it performance? I'm like, not my world. It's scoring. It's not true performance, risk analysis, understanding, you know, tenability and all those kinds of things, but it's a helpful tool. If you get a passing score, your building goes on, you don't have to do anything special. You don't have to deal with prescriptive or work area. Failing score, either the building fails, you decide and go use a different method, or you find ways to improve it to improve your score, like adding sprinklers, for example, or it's probably, again, maybe smoke detection, seeing what gets you the most increase. But it's a scoring method, in my opinion. But I guess it's being used in some areas for downtown buildings quite successfully, like at the old sort of Main Street buildings. Oops. And is pretty much, it's not, like I said, it's not applicable to repairs. It's alterations, addition, change of occupancy. I tried to make a little flow chart of sorts, but I mean, determine each characteristic, which is, I forget how many, 21 of them or so. Enter them into the table for each category, total the values, place, you know, it's pretty simple stuff. You take the total, see if it's equal to or greater than the mandatory safety scores. And then if you get it, you know, a 0 or positive, you can move on, your analysis to complete, and it passes. Or if you don't, you have to either go back, use a different method, or make some other changes or add some kind of system that the building currently does not have. And then relocated buildings, mostly this is about structural, honestly. If you do alterations or additions to a relocated building, you've got to go back into the other methods. It's really a matter of, if you move it, is the foundation appropriate? Is the wind load appropriate before you put it? Seismic, snow loads, that kind of thing. And safe for human occupancy. It does reference back to IFC, IPMC for kind of like operational maintenance stuff, like basics. So I know it's a lot of different slides and we can chat about a lot of different things, but I mean, overall, the intent of having multiple methods is provide flexibility. Like I said, there's truly 5 different methods, but of course the primary ones are prescriptive, the work area, and performance. Repairs and relocated buildings are separate, independent of those 3 methods. Chapter 3, there's a number of provisions that apply globally to all 3 methods. And I think sometimes, especially with historic buildings, that kind of probably gets lost in translation a little bit if they just jump into that chapter. Prescriptive and work area have lots of, in the end, if you look and compare, similar requirements, mostly structural, but even in the, we've been very intentionally making sure, like the acoustics is in this, both in there, the window control opening devices are the same in each. But there's a lot of similarities between them. And if you pulled away a lot of that similarity from each of them, like say you put all that stuff in chapter 3, then the prescriptive method is really more administrative than anything else. Of course, I mean, there's been debate, like there's, some ideas of what if you put all the structural stuff in chapter 3, and it's like, oh, but you start diluting the whole idea of having multiple methods. So it's a lot of debate on what makes them different and what makes them more useful or clearer to use, that kind of thing. As you see, work area has a lot more detail. Chapter 8 is the heart of that. And there's not all level 2. I mean, alteration level 2 is where work area kicks in. And not all alteration level 2 will have a work area, like a new, smoke detection system or fire alarm of any kind. I mean, I don't know that it would, I mean, if you put a sprinkler system in it, it's pretty much the issue, because I think that's the biggest issue that people look to when it triggers to alteration level 3. Historic building provisions are really just allowances. You need to understand how it works within the overall context of the work area method. And looking back to sort of prescriptive, you have kind of administrative language only, but it gives a lot of allowance, and you have to demonstrate as a jurisdiction, I guess, that there's a life safety hazard, whereas the work area method lays out things you have to do when you hit certain triggers, unless you meet some of those allowances in chapter 12. And then the performance method is an evaluation scoring method focused on fire, life safety, non-structural, not on accessibility, plumbing, structural. A lot of those things have been patched into the beginning of chapter 13 because we're realizing that without it, when you go straight to that method, you may not grab some of those things. Structural's been in there. Structural actually sends you back to the building code, whereas the other 2 methods are simply working with sort of more the existing provisions, allowances for reduced seismic, things like that. So I know that was a lot. And I have, what time is it now? So I have, for a while, if you want to chat about any questions and just have dialogue.
Thank you so much. So yeah, anyone just raise your hand or go ahead and ask Beth your questions. Okay, we've got Mike Malinowski.
Hey, Beth, thanks for taking the time and that really thorough run through. I know one of the questions that has come up in our meetings is about whether a project realistically can have multiple things. It has some repair, some parts of the project are an area of level 1, some parts include an area where there's a change of use. So you could get into a situation where the mix of activities in a building can get pretty complicated. I wanted to just get your reaction on that, because I know the question was raised by building officials concerned about the use of this additions to the California existing building code.
How you would deal with multiple.
Well, there was a concern that a project proponent could break their project submittal up into a series of small pieces and apply different chapters to different parts of the project versus looking at the holistic impact of what they're doing taken as a whole, which might be more significant than when you focused in and say, well, this area we're doing this area we're doing that, this area we're just doing a repair.
I guess maybe it comes down to, I was thinking, I mean, a lot of it circles around the whole work area thing, because I mean, really, if you're just doing alteration level 1 in this piece, there's no work area. It's not adding to anything, you're just doing it there. If you get to level 2 and you're putting a system in, still don't have work area. And so you could probably look at that as alteration level 2, because I mean, you don't really add up the different alterations, you add up whether you have work area. And a repair, I wouldn't even put that as part of that. I mean, maybe they're doing it all at the same time. But that is really a matter of, do you classify, is it truly a repair, or are they just skirting alteration level 1 and they really should be looking at a little bit of improvement in accessibility? But I think you could have multiple things going on, but maybe they have to choose one method. So like prescriptive, you could do it one way. And then if you're a work area, then you're talking about, like you're talking about, you get alteration level 1, but that doesn't add to the work area. You could have a work area going on at level 2, but level 1 is not going to add to that anyway. I mean, you could still call the whole thing level 2, and it's really a matter of how did we establish the work area, and does that push us into the next level of going to level 3? Because I was thinking, just opening up the code a little bit to look at like how they word, for instance, 802, building elements and materials, 802.1, the requirements of the section are limited to work areas in which level 2 alterations are being performed and shall apply beyond the work area where specified. So if the project has no work area and you're doing level 2 things, then that's fine. Or if you have some level 1 stuff, again, it won't kick in until that work area appears. And you might have a level 1 alteration you're doing in that work area, but that doesn't matter. Now you still have to upgrade, the vertical opening or something. I think it's really probably more of an issue of when they do, okay, project 1, all right, we have a work area, it's 25%. Project 2, we have a work area, it's 25%. Project 3, it's work area, like if they creep it in that way, I think it's more the issue than if you have, say, a repair going on at the same time, alteration level 1, alteration 2, it's how much of the building are they actually reconfiguring to then kick you up to the next level? And I don't know exactly what the answer is to that, because I feel like no matter what you do with the code, people game the system and know, and again, it's probably unfair way to classify it as, but they understand triggers. No matter what you put for a trigger, they will work to the trigger. I was saying before I got on the call that I know, for instance, because a lot of the time the issue is about sprinklers. When do you do sprinklers? That's what we argue about the most, is sprinklers. When do you trigger that? I live in Massachusetts and they have what they call a substantial renovation, which I wish I had studied up exact language, but they just kind of deal with it there and just say, if your renovation's over, I don't know, 5,000 square feet or something, renovation, they'll just count it in a different way. Then you put sprinklers in, end of argument, and they're not really looking at it from a work area standpoint. They're looking at a square footage of your building, or, and they have some definitions of what they call substantial renovation. So I don't know if it's something there or some criteria of as to when the next level would kick in. I don't know, I don't have a great answer, but I think what I was explained to me why they didn't end up putting in triggers like that was because they felt it was just going to be impossible to know how that would apply from one jurisdiction to the next, and people would just work to it. And I know the flood stuff and the accessibility, they use money, percentages and of cost and things like that, but they didn't add that for these.
Thanks, Beth. That covered. I don't see any other hands raised, so I'm going to just jump in with another question, sort of a question. As we were working through our this working group at this adoption process, early on it became clear that the complexities of Chapter 13 would make it unrealistic to try and bring that in as an alternate compliance method. And I remember chatting with you, and you had told me that other jurisdictions, I don't remember if it's New York City or New York State, have characterized Chapter 13 very similar to what we're proposing, which is it's basically almost like the provisions in 104.11, where it's an alternate methods and means framework. And I think the concern that I had heard was that anytime you get down to a numerical point system, that the potential for unintended consequences increase because the nuances and the complexities of these various life safety issues, there's a lot of judgment involved, and that's where there was concern that trying to evaluate that. So I wanted you to explain what you knew about how other jurisdictions are using Chapter 13 in a different way as we are proposing.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, it was really just when I was chatting with some of the New York City folks when they were first starting to look at this. And when you really look at, and I've thrown some of these ideas out to the Building Code Action Committee at times, and I've talked to David Bonowitz about it before, is that in a way, I mean, back when it was Chapter 34, it was at the end of it, it was kind of like, okay, I think the intent was if you couldn't meet the building code for the sort of fire, life safety, egress stuff, you could try this instead. And now it's an independent method. So I think the idea that like New York, for instance, was looking at that maybe that they would only allow it for certain older buildings as an example. I don't know if it's, I haven't done case studies to find out what works, what doesn't, but I know there is some work happening in Illinois. There's a code official I need to get back to actually, that they try to use it for some of that. But as a tool, it really is about fire, life safety, egress. In theory, in a perfect world, maybe it would be an alternative to, like, I think you're talking about back in 104.11, but like if you were in the work area method, for instance, maybe for section 802, which is building elements and materials, 803 fire protection, 804 egress. I don't think it would cover, yeah, that you could, instead of complying with that, you could go comply with, do the scoring method, see if you get a passing score. I mean, I think that's the same idea of what you're talking about, but maybe doing it like in 104.11, that for really defining for projects that were focused in on concerns, non-compliance with fire, life safety, means of egress, you could possibly use the scoring method, because when you look at 13, I mean, we've put some structural provisions in there. We used to mention accessibility, but we pulled that to Chapter 3. We have smoke alarms in Chapter 3. We have CO in Chapter 3. Minimal things you have to do, regardless of what method. And I mean, I struggled myself with the structural piece. Like, why do we give all these exceptions and allowances and go to all this trouble, these triggers for, seismic group F and everything in the prescriptive and work area, and then we just send you back to the building code for a structural analysis. And some of the argument has been, well, the idea was that to be able to do this method, your building has to at least comply with 16. I'm like, but that's not, I mean, yeah, you could argue fires, earthquakes. I get earthquake, then fire, but I don't think anybody was thinking about it at that level. So yeah, so I think I don't have case studies, and I know folks have done some of those things. But to me, it really is about the core of what that method is an alternative to fire, life safety, egress, which includes passive, active means of egress, essentially occupancy kind of things. Are they sleeping, and all those kinds of things that we've sort of worked into, how crowded a A2 is versus apartments where people are sleeping, and the risks that go along with that have kind of worked into the codes over the years. But I don't know if that really answers it, but I feel like it's really an alternative to those pieces. And it comes from Ohio originally, because when they were adopting, I think, the existing building kind of provisions at that time, they said, we'll never be able to meet some of these requirements if we don't have ways to increase our scores, because the buildings were just too big. So if that gives any perspective on it.
Thanks.
Hey, Joseph, are you still on, and is your audio working? I know that you had a question earlier.
Yeah, actually, Crystal, it was more of a comment, and I believe Beth hit on it after. It's always a point of contention for everybody that I speak with about when fire life safety needs to be, when the fire life safety system needs to be installed new, in the eventuality of, say, like a level 2 upgrade to a building area, and there's an old antiquated fire alarm system that may not operate properly. you know, what happens in that regard. And I know those are some of the challenges that we're presented with and that the AHJs deal with on a consistent basis. And I'm hoping that just pointing everybody to the CBC helped that a little bit. But you know, I was looking for her input on that, and I think she did hit it. So thank you, Beth, for your presentation today.
No problem. And some of that issue might also, I would suspect, tangle up with the fire code a little bit too, in terms of making sure that systems are maintained, operable, and those kinds of things too, which is probably more complex than this may. I mean, because in theory, this code says if you don't touch it, unless we trigger you to touch it because it's in a work area, like for instance, if you move everything around and then you're going to be back looking at the fire alarm requirements, actually an alteration, probably back at the fire alarm requirements for existing versus new, which we would have to do for change of occupancy classification. But you might be back in chapter 11 of the fire code looking at what you would have to do to put those systems in. And then, so it's more a matter of triggering whether you should have them. But I think the fire code wouldn't allow you to continue on with the system that, you know, that's sort of a distinct hazard, fire safety, you need to replace things. I don't know, I'm sure it's
Yeah.
complicated than that, but
Yeah, there's, you know, we did put pointers in to 901 should there be any substantial impact to the system's operation. And then, you know, obviously if that work area or project area does impact that system, then, you know, the systems have to be in compliance with the CFC. So we made that really clear. And sprinklers as well. 903 is the pointer for that. So we're pretty consistent on that from chapter 7 and 8. Actually 7, 8, and 9, if I'm not mistaken, Michael. But thanks, Beth, again.
no problem. Just checking to see if there's any hands.
Beth, I don't know if we did this in the beginning, but maybe if you give a little background as to, you know, your presidency and who you are.
I could have dove right into that like a typical engineer today. Some days I pull it off. It's Monday, right?
Yes.
So yeah, just for a little bit of background, my background is fire engineering. A million years ago, went to Worcester Polytechnic Institute, got my master's, well, undergraduate in structural actually, and then right on to master's in fire protection. But so I've been with some form of the International Code Council dating back to the legacy days of I used to work for ICBO. I was in California actually for 6 years. And I grew up under the Uniform Fire Code. But I've been there for 27 years. I've been doing this code stuff. And I've been involved in the Society of Fire Protection Engineers pretty much my whole career. It really connects a lot with the professional engineering license requirements. And my original PE license, which is me title, I should say, in California, is from California. And then I have it in Massachusetts, but also a fellow of the Society of Fire Protection Engineers. And this year I'm the president of Society of Fire Protection Engineers, which has been an interesting journey, leading a board and all those kinds of things. But it's a nice connection. I always feel like I often look back at my career. I'm like, did I do that engineering thing I went to school for? And I realized that I have, just in a different way, but like connecting the policy with the technical. And so that's kind of my background, but I get involved in all sorts of different things: performance code, fire code, existing building code. I work with GR folks. I see Carl and Susan are both on here. I've worked with Susan my entire career off and on, pretty much. We were in the same office in the beginning. But yeah, just a little bit of background. So I just sort of dived right into existing building code. Let's go. But yeah.
Thank you for that. I don't see any other hands raised. And I know that there will be, you know, some interest in either sharing this recording or getting the PDF. So prior to the meeting, Beth and I discussed providing those to the work group. So would you say about a week or
I
the
can,
end of this week?
I can send the PDF right after we get off the call here.
Very good. Thank you so much. Is Chief Anderson still on? I know he was on for a minute. He's running a different department at the same time. So I guess we'll end the meeting early and really appreciate your time and thank you so much to everyone that joined in.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And